That mutt doesn't belong on this street, Kade. Get rid of it, or animal control will do it for you." "He's not causing you any harm, Garrick. He just sleeps under my porch." "Everything about you causes me a headache. That includes the dog." Weston Kade didn't raise his voice. He crouched down, rested a hand on the scruffy terrier mix pressed against his leg, and looked up at the man in the pressed gray suit standing on his gravel driveway. 6 months from now, that same man would be standing in a packed town hall, watching his entire empire collapse because of a dog nobody wanted and a secret buried under an oak tree that had waited 40 years to be found. If you love stories where quiet people win in front of a crowd, hit that like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This one's worth staying till the end for. Fallow Creek was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody's business, which meant everybody already knew Weston Kade was raising his 8-year-old daughter alone, working 60-hour weeks as a carpenter, and living paycheck to paycheck in a house his grandfather left him. What nobody knew yet, not the neighbors, not the county, not even Weston himself, was that the stray dog sleeping under his porch had chosen that house for a reason. Garrick Colton turned on his heel and walked back toward his black pickup truck without another word. He didn't slam the door. He didn't need to. Men like Garrick Colton didn't waste energy on people they'd already decided to erase. Weston watched the truck pull away, then looked down at the dog. "Guess it's you and me against the world, buddy," he said quietly. The dog just leaned harder into his leg, eyes fixed on the tree line at the edge of the property, like he was standing guard over something Weston hadn't found yet.
Weston Kade had lived in Fallow Creek his entire life, in the same one-story house on Larkspur Road that his grandfather, Silas Kade, built in 1962. The house had settled crooked over the decades, the porch sagged on one side, and the paint had faded from forest green to something closer to gray. But it was paid off, and paid off meant everything to a man raising a daughter on a carpenter's income. His daughter, Wrenley, was 8 years old and possessed the kind of unshakable curiosity that made teachers write "asks excellent questions" on every report card. She collected rocks she thought were fossils, kept a notebook of bird sightings, and had been begging her father for a dog since she was 5. "We can't afford a dog, Wren," Weston told her more times than he could count. "Dogs need food, vet visits, all of it. Money's tight enough." "What if the dog doesn't cost anything?" she'd asked one morning in March, 3 weeks before Garrick Colton showed up in the driveway. "What if he just shows up?" That was exactly what happened. The dog appeared on a Tuesday, scrawny and matted, one ear torn, ribs visible under a coat the color of dead leaves. He didn't beg for food at first. He just sat at the edge of the property line, near the old oak tree that had stood there longer than the house itself, watching the family with an intensity that unsettled Weston more than it comforted him. "He's not scared of us," Wrenley observed, kneeling in the grass 10 feet from the animal. "He's watching the tree." Weston hadn't thought much of it then. He figured the dog was just cautious, the way strays tended to be after a life of being chased off porches and yelled at by strangers. He left out a bowl of water. 2 days later, he added scraps of chicken. By the end of the first week, the dog had a name. "Bramble," Wrenley announced one evening, pointing at the thorny scrub brush growing wild near the fence line where the dog liked to nap. "Because he's scruffy and prickly, but he's not actually mean." Bramble didn't come inside the house for another 2 weeks. He slept under the porch, positioned in a way that gave him a clear line of sight to the oak tree at all hours. Weston noticed the pattern eventually. The dog patrolled a rough circle between the porch, the fence, and the base of that tree, night after night, like he was clocking in for a job nobody had hired him for. Fallow Creek itself was changing fast that spring. A development company called Colton Ridge Partners had been buying up parcels of land on the east side of town for 18 months, promising a resort complex that would put Fallow Creek on the map. Garrick Colton, the man behind the company, had grown up 2 towns over and made his fortune flipping vacation properties along the coast before setting his sights inland. Weston's 5 acres sat directly in the middle of the parcel Colton needed to complete his project. It bordered the creek, had frontage on the county road, and, more importantly, though Weston didn't know this yet, it held mineral and water rights that dated back to a land grant nobody in town remembered existed. Garrick had made 3 offers on the property over the past year. Each one was lower than the last, and each one came wrapped in a different kind of pressure. A friendly visit, a letter from a lawyer, a mention of code compliance concerns that never seemed to affect anyone else's property on the street. "He wants my land," Weston told his coworker, Desmond Okafor, one afternoon on a job site. "Keeps sending people around. First it was money, now it's threats about code violations that don't even exist." "You gonna sell?" Desmond asked, hammering a nail into a stud. "It's my grandfather's house. Wren's whole life is on that street." Weston shook his head. "I don't care what he offers." That answer, spoken plainly on a random Thursday, was the sentence that started the war. Because Garrick Colton was not a man accustomed to hearing no, and he had already told his investors the deal was as good as done. The pressure escalated slowly at first, the way these things always do, so that by the time Weston recognized the pattern, he was already 3 steps behind. A county inspector showed up unannounced in April, citing a complaint about an unpermitted structure, the tool shed Weston's grandfather built in 1968, standing exactly where it always had. Weston produced the original permit from a folder he kept in a fireproof box, but the inspector still wrote him up for a re-inspection fee that hadn't existed on any form Weston had ever seen. 2 weeks later, Animal Control received a complaint about a dangerous stray roaming Larkspur Road. Officers found Bramble sleeping peacefully under the porch, tail wagging at strangers, no history of aggression whatsoever. They left with an apology to Weston and a note in their file that the complaint had come from an address associated with Colton Ridge Partners. "He's trying to wear you down," Desmond said one evening, sitting on Weston's porch steps while Bramble dozed nearby. "Death by 1,000 paperwork cuts." "It's working," Weston admitted. "Not on the land, but it's exhausting." The breaking point came at the town council meeting in early May, held in the community center on Route 9, the kind of meeting that usually drew 12 people and a plate of store-brand cookies. This one drew nearly 80 because Colton Ridge Partners had placed a rezoning request on the agenda and half the town had opinions about it. Weston sat in the 3rd row with Wrenley beside him, coloring quietly in a notebook while adults argued about traffic studies and property values. When the meeting reached public comment, Garrick Colton stood up first, dressed in a navy suit that looked out of place among flannel shirts and work boots. "This project brings 400 jobs to Fallow Creek," Garrick said, addressing the council with practiced warmth. "The only obstacle is a handful of holdout properties owned by people who don't understand what they're standing in the way of." He didn't say Weston's name. He didn't need to. Every head in the room turned toward the 3rd row. "Mr. Kade's property, for instance," Garrick continued, gesturing loosely in Weston's direction, "sits on land that's barely maintained, tied up in permit violations, and frankly, holding this whole town back from opportunity most people would kill for." Weston stood up slowly. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses a confrontation about to happen. "My grandfather built that house with his own hands in 1962, Weston said, his voice level and calm. "I've lived there my whole life. I raised my daughter there, and every violation your company's filed against me has been dismissed because there was nothing to find." "Sentiment doesn't pay county taxes, Mr. Kade," Garrick replied, a thin smile on his face. "No," Weston said, "but it's not for sale either." A ripple of applause moved through part of the room, not everyone, but enough that Garrick's smile flickered for half a second before he recovered it. He sat back down without another word, but his eyes stayed locked on Weston for the rest of the meeting, calculating something. Wrenley tugged her father's sleeve as they walked back to the truck afterward. "Was that man mean to you, Dad?" "He tried to be. Didn't work." That night, Bramble refused to settle. He paced the fence line for nearly 2 hours, growling low at nothing Weston could see, before finally digging furiously at the base of the old oak tree, flinging dirt in every direction until his paws bled a little at the pads. Weston pulled him away gently, worried the dog had lost his mind or found a nest of something dangerous. But when he knelt down to inspect the hole the next morning, he found something that had nothing to do with animals at all. A corner of rusted metal, buried maybe 18 inches down, catching the early light. Weston almost didn't dig further. He had a full day of framing work scheduled, a daughter to get to school, and a general suspicion that whatever Bramble had unearthed was probably an old fence post or a piece of scrap from decades of yard work. But something about the way the dog stood over the hole, refusing to move, refusing to eat breakfast, made him grab a shovel instead of walking away. 20 minutes later, he was kneeling in the dirt with a metal box in his lap, roughly the size of a toolbox, sealed with a latch that had rusted shut. Wrenley crouched beside him, forgetting entirely about the school bus schedule. "What is it?" she whispered, like the yard itself demanded quiet. "I don't know yet," Weston admitted. It took a hammer, a flathead screwdriver, and 15 frustrated minutes to break the latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept most of the moisture out, Weston found a stack of documents, a small leather journal, and a folded map that crackled when he opened it. The journal belonged to his grandfather, Silas Kade. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same tight, slanted script Weston remembered from birthday cards as a kid. The first legible entry, dated March 1961, stopped him cold. "Filed the claim today. Water rights and mineral rights both. 5 acres along the creek bend. Recorded under the original land grant from 1889. Nobody in this county remembers that grant exists anymore, except the courthouse basement. Good. Let them forget. This land will matter again someday. And when it does, it needs to belong to family, not to whoever's got the deepest pockets in town." Weston read the entry 3 times before he fully understood what he was holding. The documents in the box weren't just an old deed. They were a certified copy of an 1889 territorial land grant, predating every modern zoning law in the county, that guaranteed water and mineral rights to whoever held title to that specific 5-acre parcel, Weston's parcel, regardless of any rezoning request the county council might approve. His grandfather had spent years quietly verifying and refiling that claim through the 1960s and 70s, anticipating exactly the kind of development pressure Weston was facing now, decades before Garrick Colton was even born. "Dad," Wrenley said, staring at the map, "is this treasure?" "Sort of," Weston said, and for the first time in weeks he actually laughed. "It's better than treasure, kiddo. It's proof." He called his coworker Desmond that evening, then a family friend named Priscilla Van Tongeren, who worked as the county's historical records archivist and had a reputation for knowing more about Fallow Creek's paperwork trail than the county itself did. Priscilla arrived within an hour, glasses pushed up into gray hair, and spent nearly 40 minutes examining the documents at Weston's kitchen table without saying a word.
"This is real," she finally said. "I've seen references to this grant in old survey ledgers, but I always assumed the physical documentation was lost in the courthouse fire back in '74. Your grandfather must have pulled certified copies before that happened." "What does it mean for the rezoning?" Weston asked. "It means Colton Ridge Partners can't touch your water or mineral rights, no matter what the council approves," Priscilla said. "And depending on how their development plan is structured, if they need creek access to make the resort work at all—" "They need my land," Weston finished. "They need this exact 5 acres, Priscilla corrected, not just any parcel nearby, this one specifically." Weston sat back in his chair, the pieces falling into place with a clarity that made his stomach tighten.
Garrick Colton hadn't been targeting him out of random cruelty or business efficiency. He'd been targeting him because Weston's crooked little house sat on top of the one thing his entire 400 jobs resort promise couldn't survive without. Bramble, curled by the back door through all of it, lifted his head once, looked at the box on the table, and let out a low, satisfied huff, like a guard finally allowed to rest. Priscilla Van Tongeren didn't waste time once she understood what she was looking at. She spent the next several days cross-referencing the 1889 grant against modern county survey records, working late into the evenings at the archive building on 5th Street, determined to build a case too solid for anyone to dismiss. "Colton's team is going to challenge authenticity the second they see this," she warned Weston over the phone. "Men like him don't lose gracefully. He's going to come at you with lawyers, not apologies." "Let him," Weston said. "I've got the original box, the sealed journal, and now certified county records to back it up. That's not something you argue away in a conference room." Weston kept working through it all, because bills didn't pause for buried treasure. He framed houses by day, and by night he sat at his kitchen table with Priscilla's notes and his grandfather's journal, piecing together a story 40 years in the making. Wrenley helped by drawing a timeline on poster board for a school project, unknowingly turning her father's legal battle into a family history lesson she was proud to show her class. Word moved fast in a town the size of Fallow Creek. By the second week, half the community had heard some version of the story, that Weston Kade had dug up proof his family's land couldn't legally be touched, that Garrick Colton's big development might be dead before it started. Neighbors who'd never said more than a passing hello started stopping by with casseroles and questions. "Is it true you found something under that old tree?" asked Marguerite Loomis, who ran the hardware store downtown. "Whole town's talking about it." "It's true," Weston said simply. "Good," Marguerite replied, not bothering to hide her satisfaction. "Man's been buying up half the county like he owns the place already. Somebody standing their ground is refreshing." Not everyone was thrilled, of course. A handful of residents had already sold their properties to Colton Ridge Partners, banking on the promised jobs and rising home values the resort was supposed to bring. Weston understood their frustration, even as he refused to apologize for holding his ground. His fight wasn't against the town's hope for opportunity, it was against a man who'd tried to bulldoze a family out of their home through intimidation instead of honesty. Garrick Colton, for his part, went quiet for nearly 10 days, which worried Weston more than any threat could have. Quiet, from a man like that, rarely meant surrender. The silence broke on a Wednesday afternoon when a certified letter arrived from a law firm 2 counties over, disputing the authenticity of the 1889 grant and demanding Weston cease any public claims regarding his property's legal status pending review. The letter was aggressive, full of legal language designed to intimidate a carpenter with no law degree into backing down quietly. Weston read it twice, then handed it to Priscilla. "They're scared," she said, scanning the pages. "This isn't the language of a company that thinks it's going to win. This is the language of a company trying to buy time." "Time for what?" "To find a way to discredit you before the county council session," Priscilla said. There's a public hearing scheduled in 9 days on the final rezoning vote. If your documentation holds up, it kills their project on the spot. If they can make it look fraudulent first, even for a week, it might be enough to push the vote through before anyone checks the facts. Weston thought about Garrick standing at that podium months earlier, calling him a holdout, gesturing toward his own family in front of the entire town. He thought about the fake code violations, the false animal control complaint, the years his grandfather had spent quietly protecting a piece of land nobody else valued. "Then we don't wait for them to come after me," Weston said. "We bring it to the hearing ourselves, all of it, in front of everyone." Priscilla smiled for the first time in days. "Now you're thinking like your grandfather." That night, walking Bramble along the fence line under a sky full of early summer stars, Weston found himself talking out loud to a dog who couldn't understand a word of it. "You knew, didn't you? Somehow you knew there was something worth protecting back there before any of us did." Bramble pressed his head against Weston's leg and said nothing at all, which felt, somehow, like the truest answer he could give. The county council chamber was standing room only on the night of the hearing, nearly 200 people packed into a space built for 80, spilling into the hallway and craning their necks through open doors. Word had spread that something big was coming, and Fallow Creek had never been a town to miss a good show. Garrick Colton arrived 20 minutes early with 2 attorneys flanking him, dressed in a charcoal suit sharper than anything he'd worn to the last meeting. He nodded politely to a few council members, shook hands with the mayor, and settled into the front row with the calm confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. Weston arrived with Priscilla, a folder of certified documents, and Wrenley sitting beside him in her best dress, insisting she wanted to be there for what she called the treasure part. Bramble waited outside in the truck because dogs weren't permitted inside county buildings, though Weston privately wished the animal could see how this ended. The rezoning vote came up third on the agenda. Garrick's attorney spoke first, delivering a polished argument about job creation, tax revenue, and regional growth, carefully avoiding any direct mention of the disputed parcel until the very end. "There remains one unresolved property dispute," the attorney said, glancing toward Weston, "involving claims of historical land rights that our legal team has found no credible basis for." That was Weston's moment, and he didn't hesitate. "I'd like to address the council," he said, standing before anyone called on him. The council chair, an older woman named Beatrix Nunez, who'd run these meetings for over a decade, gestured him forward without objection. 200 people went quiet in a way that made the room feel smaller than it was. Weston walked to the podium with the folder under his arm, Priscilla a step behind him, carrying a second set of certified copies for the council's record. "My grandfather, Silas Kade, filed a territorial land grant claim in 1889 on this exact parcel. Water rights and mineral rights both," Weston said, his voice steady, carrying to the back of the room. "He spent years recertifying that claim through the county long before any of you were on this council. I found the original documentation 2 weeks ago, buried under an oak tree on my own property." He held up the sealed county certification Priscilla had secured, the ink still fresh on the notarized authentication. "This isn't a family legend, it's recorded law, and it means Colton Ridge Partners cannot legally develop this parcel for a resort that requires creek access, no matter what this council votes tonight." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Garrick's attorney rose immediately, objecting, calling the documents unverified, demanding time for independent review. Priscilla stepped forward calmly and placed a second folder on the council's table. "The county archive has already completed independent verification," she said. "I filed the formal authentication report 3 days ago. It's a matter of public record as of this afternoon." The room turned,
almost as one, toward Colton.
His composure cracked for the first time Weston had ever witnessed. He stood halfway out of his seat, jaw tight, and for one brief second looked less like a polished developer and more like a man watching 4 years of quiet manipulation collapse in front of the entire town that once trusted him. "This is a delay tactic," Garrick said, louder than he probably intended. "Convenient timing, don't you think? A buried box right before the vote?" "My grandfather buried it in 1962, long before you ever set foot in Fallow Creek. The timing wasn't convenient, it was patient." That line landed across the room like a held breath finally released. Someone near the back began clapping, and it spread before Beatrix Nunez could even gavel for order. "One more thing," Weston added, once the room quieted again. "The code violations your company filed against my property this spring, every single one was investigated and dismissed. The animal control complaint about my dog came from an address linked directly to Colton Ridge Partners. I have the incident report right here if the council wants a copy." He set the paper on the table beside Priscilla's folder. Garrick didn't answer. He sat back down slowly, his 2 attorneys leaning in to whisper, their earlier confidence visibly draining out of the room, along with the last of his credibility. The council voted to table the rezoning request indefinitely, pending full review of the land grant's implications, effectively killing the resort project in its current form. Beatrix Nunez thanked Weston for his transparency, and the room erupted into applause, loud enough that Wrenley covered her ears and grinned at the same time. Weston found Garrick's eyes across the chamber as people began filing out. There was no apology in them, no grace in defeat, only the cold calculation of a man recalculating his next move from a position he never imagined he'd be forced into. He gathered his attorneys and left through a side door without speaking to a single person on his way out, the crowd parting around him like water around a stone nobody wanted to touch anymore. Weston didn't watch him go. He knelt down instead and hugged his daughter, who was already talking about how she was going to tell her entire class that her dog found real, actual treasure. The story didn't end that night, but the direction of it did, and that made all the difference. Colton Ridge Partners quietly withdrew its remaining land offers across Fallow Creek within a month, unable to justify a resort project that couldn't secure creek access. 2 investors pulled out publicly, citing unresolved legal complications, language everyone in town understood to mean Garrick Colton had oversold a deal that was never as solid as he claimed. He sold his remaining local holdings by late summer and left the county altogether, last seen, according to Marguerite at the hardware store, arguing with a different set of investors 2 towns over about a different piece of land nobody had checked the history on yet. Weston never heard from him again. He didn't need to. Some men only exist in your story long enough to prove what you're made of, and Garrick Colton had served that purpose completely. The land itself became something Weston hadn't expected. With Priscilla's help and a modest grant from the County Historical Society, the 5 acres along the creek were formally registered as a protected heritage site, preserving both the original land grant and the oak tree where Bramble had dug up his grandfather's box. Weston kept the house, kept the tool shed, and added a small wooden sign near the tree line that read simply, "Silas Kade, 1889-2026. Some things are worth waiting for." Bramble moved inside permanently that autumn, no longer sleeping under the porch on patrol, though he still walked the fence line every evening out of habit more than necessity. Wrenley slept better knowing he was curled at the foot of her bed instead of standing guard in the dark, and Weston found himself grateful in a way he couldn't fully explain for a stray dog who'd shown up on a random Tuesday and changed the entire trajectory of his family's future.
His carpentry business grew steadily over the following year, not because of the land dispute directly, but because half the town now knew his name for reasons that had nothing to do with quiet desperation and everything to do with quiet integrity. People wanted to hire the man who'd stood his ground without raising his voice, who'd protected his daughter's home instead of cashing out for an easy payday. One evening in early spring, almost a full year after that first confrontation in the driveway, Weston sat on the porch steps with Wrenley, watching Bramble chase fireflies across the yard he'd once patrolled like a soldier. "Do you think he knew about the box, before any of us did?" Weston thought about it for a long moment, watching the dog's silhouette move against the darkening tree line. "I think some things protect what matters even when nobody's told them to," he said. "Maybe he just recognized something worth guarding." Wrenley nodded like that made perfect sense to an 8-year-old, and maybe it did. The house on Larkspur Road still stood crooked, still needed a fresh coat of paint, and still belonged to the Kade family exactly the way Silas Kade intended when he buried that box beneath the oak tree over 60 years earlier. Some inheritances come in the form of money, others come in the form of patience, paperwork, and a stray dog who refused to let anyone forget what was worth protecting. Weston Kade never asked for a fight, but when it came to his front porch, he didn't run from it either. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that mattered. If this story hit you right, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories just like this one, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that quiet people win too. Drop a comment below and tell me which line stuck with you most.